World of Warfare presents Operation Varsity. By early 1945, Allied and Soviet forces had pushed up against Germany's borders, the Soviets to the east, the Allies to the west, leaving Allied war leaders to wrestle with logistical roadblocks in their supply lines between their bases in England and Holland, hundreds of miles away, made worse by the wholesale destruction of nearly all continental ports in their control. Exhausted after a series of hard-fought battles in the fall and winter, compounded by replacement shortages for British and Canadian units in late 1944, Allied leaders under the command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower focused on the strategic problem of how to get their Anglo-American forces across the last major natural obstacle during their sweep into Germany, the Rhine River. On the other side of the conflict, as the Allies closed in on Berlin against a badly weakened Wehrmacht and an almost non-existent Luftwaffe, Nazi leaders promised fierce resistance in the face of the Allies' now overwhelming force. Following difficult and sometimes contentious debates, Eisenhower decided that the attack on Germany, known as Operation Plunder, would be led by General Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group in the northern Rhineland, due mainly to the fact that the land was flat and therefore ripe for a rapid mobile invasion across the North German plain. Incensed by the decision, American generals Omar Bradley and George S. Patton swallowed their pride in the name of common victory, despite their belief that supply shortages could not support an invasion attempt along the entirety of the Western Front. Accordingly, on February 8, 1945, the 21st Army Group launched its offensive push for the Rhine, including the 2nd British Army, the 1st Canadian Army, and later the U.S. 9th Army, with the objective of seizing an intact bridge at Wesel. Instead, Allied forces spent weeks locked in grueling combat as they slowly pushed German forces deeper into the motherland. By the time the U.S. 9th Army joined the fight after winter floodwaters had receded, the Allies had pushed the Germans back across the Rhine by March 10th, but not before the Germans managed to destroy the last bridge across the mighty river. While contemporaries and now historians have routinely criticized Field Marshal Montgomery for his cautious, methodical, foot-dragging decision-making style, U.S. 9th Army Commander General Bill Simpson wanted to hold on to their momentum by crossing the Rhine immediately before German troops could recover from their string of recent defeats west of the river. While some have suggested that Montgomery wanted to avoid another failure like Operation Market Garden at Arnhem in the fall of 1944, Monty decided to wait until full supply line preparations could be achieved before crossing the Rhine, prompting frustrated U.S. war leaders to take offensive initiatives of their own. On March the 7th, 1st U.S. Army forces surprised German troops defending the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, capturing it intact, while on March 22nd, Patton took great pleasure at beating his rival Monty to the punch when he began ferrying his men across the Rhine at Oppenheim, only to face off with renewed German resistance thanks to Wehrmacht reinforcements sent in from the north. Montgomery's plan for Operation Plunder's twofold attack was finally planned for March 23rd when Allied ground forces would cross the Rhine after a relentless artillery bombardment. The following morning, Operation Varsity would commence with an objective of inserting some 16,000 Allied paratroopers and glider-borne infantrymen east and in front of the ground forces, before linking up to cross into the heavily industrialized Ruhr region of Germany, making Varsity the largest single-day airborne invasion in the history of mechanized warfare. In Monty's own words, the intention is to cross the Rhine north of the Ruhr and secure a firm bridgehead, with the view to developing operations to isolate the Ruhr and to penetrate deeper into Germany. As the offensive began late on the evening of March 23rd, Eisenhower, English Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Field Marshal Alanbrooke looked on from a nearby hill as Allied bombers and artillery batteries began a 4-hour assault on German positions in advance of the crossing. After the bombardment ended, the 51st Highland Division crossed near the town of Rees, while the 15th Scottish and the 1st British Commando Brigade crossed just north of Wesel and the Deersford Forest. The U.S. 30th and 79th Divisions completed the initial wave between Wesel and Dinslaken, followed by a second wave made up of British, American, and Canadian infantry units, before consolidating their bridgeheads to the east of the Rhine. The Highlanders captured Rees by the end of March 24th at a cost of losing their commanding general, Tom Rennie. Fighting in Wesel was equally bitter, despite badly weakened German defenders, costing the life of German General Alfred Deutsch. And while conflicting stories continue to persist regarding his death, British Commando Philip Pritchard said they came upon a lance corporal digging a grave in war-torn Wesel, who had shot the German officer after Deutsch maintained that he would not surrender to anyone of lesser or equal rank. Furious over the killing, Brigadier General Mills Roberts ordered the lance corporal to bury the general before moving on with his unit. Of the 30 American casualties on the 24th, most were lost to hypothermia when a boat capsized in the frigid waters of the Rhine. By late afternoon that same day, the 30th Division no longer faced organized German resistance, while the Americans at Remagen breached German defenses along the entirety of their sector near the river Essel, allowing the Army Corps of Engineers to throw up more and more floating bridges across the river, which then opened the door for a total of 1.2 million Allied fighters and more than 5,000 artillery pieces to cross into the Ruhr. By the end of the day, the Allies had established a bridgehead 25 miles long and 6 miles deep. Beginning at 10 a.m. on March 24th, Operation Varsity witnessed 1,700 transport planes and 1,348 gliders and a defensive force of 900 escort fighters to land 16,000 British, Canadian, and American troops east of the river, despite heavy losses due to German anti-aircraft fire. To Allied soldiers sitting in such sitting duck targets as a slow-moving troop glider, like U.S. serviceman Jack Areolo, the insertion made them feel completely defenseless in the air. The anti-aircraft fire was so thick, I believe we could have got out and walked on it, he later recalled. Bullets and flak were coming up through the glider, and every time one hit the bottom of the glider and went out through the top, it sounded like the crack of a whip, only 10 times louder. Very demoralizing. In command of a 20mm anti-aircraft battery on the ground, German Lieutenant Otto Leitner recalled that with so many aircraft, it was difficult not to hit something. I ordered my men to keep firing in the hope that by filling the sky with metal, some of it would do some damage. As the day progressed, troops of the 6th British and 17th U.S. Airborne Divisions delivered paratroopers into 10 landing zones with an objective of establishing high ground positions along the River Essel, before linking up with Allied ground forces advancing east from the Rhine. Some units, like the U.S. 507th Parachute Regiment near the Deersford Forest, landed in the wrong place, forcing them first to orient and reposition themselves before they could execute their objectives. Pilot error caused other paratroopers from the 313th Parachute Infantry Regiment to miss their drop zone, landing instead on a British drop zone. Fighting in and around the village of Hammenkeln was met by fierce German resistance, but once Allied troops managed to link up and organize, they soon overwhelmed and outnumbered German defenders in both manpower, munitions, and mechanized equipment. For their part, the British made quick work of taking the town of Hammenkeln until the Ochsenbucks Regiment experienced resistance during their attempts to hold a bridge over the River Westle, when German General Johann Blaskowitz sent in tanks from the 116th Panzer Division, forcing the Ochsenbucks to abandon the bridge, but not before blowing it up to prevent further German progress. The Canadians also had a nasty fight on their hands, and when Medic Corporal Frederick Topham witnessed 2 other medics killed as they attempted to treat a downed soldier in the open, when Topham ran to the fallen man's aid, he too was shot through the nose. Battling through severe bleeding and intense pain, Topham carried the wounded man to the protection of a nearby wooded area, showing a complete disregard for heavy and accurate enemy fire. Once the man was safely out of harm's way, over the next 2 hours of fighting, Topham eventually came upon a Morris Oxford armored personnel carrier that had just received a direct hit by enemy mortar fire. As the mortar assault continued, Topham again risked his life to rescue all 3 occupants from the burning carrier, and while one passed away shortly after he was freed, the 2 others owed their lives to Topham's actions. Topham would go on to receive the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest medal for valor, while 2 U.S. servicemen were awarded the Medal of Honor, America's own highest medal for valor, for their actions during Operation Varsity. British and American ground forces linked up with the paratroopers on March 25th, on the same day that Churchill insisted on crossing the Rhine in a Buffalo amphibian, despite the fact that the river was still within range of German artillery batteries. As newsreel cameras captured the moment when Churchill landed on the eastern bank of the Rhine, a feat no foreign army had achieved in over 140 years, a German artillery observer in nearby Emmerich wrote in his diary, "From yesterday evening until this morning again, a heavy barrage of artillery attacks. Also particularly heavy fighter-bomber activity and aerial observation. Untroubled by man's futile efforts, nature graced this Sunday with glorious spring sunshine." In tandem with Operation Plunder, Varsity achieved its objectives by securing a major Rhine crossing for the Allies' push toward Berlin. However, critics have since claimed that Varsity was too costly, in light of the fact that ground forces may have been able to achieve the same goals with far less loss of life, pointing specifically to the high number of downed C-46 transport planes that lacked self-sealing fuel tanks, which saw them catch fire more easily when hit by enemy ground fire. By March 28th, German resistance east of the Rhine was contained to isolated pockets, as remnants of the once mighty Wehrmacht were on the run along the entirety of the Western Front, allowing the Americans to widen their bridgeheads before liberating a notorious forced labor camp at Rees. Allied armor now pushed into the Ruhr for strikes into central Germany, leading Churchill to remark at a dinner party that the German is whipped. Fighting would continue for another painful and bloody month, but the final death knell for the Third Reich grew more imminent with each passing day. Although overall casualties had been lighter than at first predicted, by nightfall on March 24th, the 6th Airborne Division had suffered some 1,400 killed, wounded, or missing in action of a total fighting force of 7,220, at the same time claiming around 1,500 prisoners of war. The 17th Airborne Division reported some 1,300 casualties out of 9,650 personnel involved, claiming 2,000 POWs. Between the 24th through March 29th, the 17th suffered an additional 1,346 casualties, while 77 transport planes were shot down or suffered significant damage by anti-aircraft fire. An additional 16 bombers were lost by the 8th Air Force during supply drops, making Operation Varsity one of the last major battlefields of World War II Europe.